Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar held as part of the Victorian Building Authority's Practitioner Education Series. My name is Erna Lay, Manager of Technical Services, and I will be your host for today. I'll just like to introduce to you guys that we are running a hybrid webinar today. It combines a live streaming of learning content with interactive polls and Q&As answered by our technical team. So I encourage you all to please type your questions in the Q&A chat functions during the live streaming and also participate in our live polls. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respect to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people attending the session today. Today you will hear from Sean Braden. Sean has 15 years building surveying experience in Western Australia and Victoria. He is a registered unlimited building surveyor in Western Australia. Sean is experienced in approvals as well as regulatory and policy work for both local and state governments. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, the VMIA is committed to ensuring a confident and thriving industry and collaborates with stakeholders to enhance practitioners' competency and deliver improved outcomes for the community. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understand how to do things correctly and discourage risky, harmful or illegal behaviours in the building and plumbing industries. Today's webinar will be about NCC 2022 Energy Efficiency Volume 1. Now, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded and the link of this presentation will be made available on our websites, along with our previous webinars. We will be answering some pre-submitted questions during the Q&A sessions at the end of the hybrid webinar. Please still submit your questions via the Q&A chat function during the presentation, as our technical team will be available live to answer your questions in the chat room. Also, during the webinar, we will be conducting live polls. Use the QR code reference on the slide to direct you to the relevant websites relating to the topic being presented today. Just a quick reminder, due to the large volume of questions received during the live streaming of the learning content, we will do our best to answer as many of your questions as possible. After the hybrid webinar, we will collate all the unanswered questions and will provide an answer to as many of these as possible. Again, a copy of the question and answers will be sent out in the weeks following this hybrid webinar. Sean, I will now hand over to you.
Thanks, Anna. I'll start off with the purpose of the webinar and why we're here and why it is important that we go through this. So we're going to discuss the compliance with NCC 2022 for energy efficiency. Now, in doing that, we're going to be supporting the ABCB's webinars. They've gone through a lot of the detail in the changes, but our point of difference is we're going to be looking closely at the regulatory overview and how NCC compliance is going to be achieved. During this as well, we're going to start addressing a series of common questions that we get asked on a regular basis, and that's going to be associated to energy efficiency and particularly the compliance pathways for energy efficiency. Now, at the end of this session, we're hoping that you're going to have an improved, bigger picture of compliance with the NCC for energy efficiency and some familiarity with the changes that are coming through in NCC 2022. The scope of today's sessions will just be covering NCC Volume 1, so we'll be looking at Class 2 to 9 buildings only. We won't be looking at a Class 1 single dwelling, just Class 2 to 9s. And we'll also be looking purely at energy efficiency provisions only of Part J of the NCC. So very much a limited scope around Volume 1 in energy efficiency. And the structure of today's session, we'll look at the compliance overview of NCC 2022. Then we'll break it down as the NCC does. So we'll look at the performance requirements. We'll look at DTS, performance solutions, how we satisfy our performance requirements that way. Then we'll touch on the governing requirements, which will lead into transition provisions from 2019 into 2022. But to start off with, we'll have a broad look at the compliance overview of the NCC. Now, it's important that we look at the objectives and the functional statements of Part J of Volume 1. Now, the objectives and the functional statements, these are non-mandatory, but although they're non-mandatory, they give you a really good sense of why we're here, what's the purpose of energy efficiency provisions, and what we're trying to achieve. So the objectives have a number of clauses that are added, and this is just a cut and paste directly out of the NCC. And the same with the functional statements, they've got a number of different clauses added. So in the past, it was regularly primarily about greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, other things were in there, but we were primarily focused on greenhouse gas emissions. Now we're looking more broadly, and we're looking at peak energy demands, improving occupant health and amenity, and so on. So there's a broader scope of requirements or intent per se for NCC 2022. And compliance, what does compliance with the NCC actually look like? I've got A2G1 clause here, which is part of the governing requirements, but is really, in my view, is probably the most important clause in the entire NCC, because it tells you what compliance actually looks like within the NCC. And compliance is complying with the governing requirements as well as the performance requirements. Now, when we're looking at this in the context of energy efficiency, it is no different to any other part. We have to satisfy the performance requirements, and as we satisfy those, we have to make sure we meet the governing requirements. And that is what compliance is going to be. Now, there are changes to both governing and performance requirements that are relevant to energy efficiency, which we'll discuss. So we'll jump in and we'll have a closer look at the performance requirements now. So in 2019 NCC, we had a single performance requirement being JP1 for energy usage, or energy use, sorry. As we move into NCC 2022, we've expanded that, and now we have 4 performance requirements. So we've got J1P1, energy use, we've got J1P2 and J1P3, which are thermal performance, and there's an energy use there. And these ones are just for a sole occupancy unit, or an SOU, within a Class 2 building or a Class 4 part of a building. So they're very much aligned with Class 2 and Class 4. And then we go back to J1P4, which is all your Class 2 to 9 buildings. And we're looking at renewable energy and electric vehicle charging. If we look at that in a table form, we've got our 4 performance requirements, and they're on the right-hand side of that, we've got where they're going to be applicable. So J1P1, that's going to be applicable to your Class 2 common areas and Class 3, 5 to 9. So all those broader areas, but then J1, P2 and P3, we're just going to be looking at a Class 2 SOU and a Class 4 part of the building. And then we move back out to J1, P4, and we're going to be looking at the entirety of Class 2 to 9. So again, some of the key changes are we've got particular performance requirements relevant to Class 2 SOUs and Class 4 parts. And we've also introduced a renewable energy and EV charging set of provisions to go with that. Now, if we apply this to a building so we can start looking and getting a visual representation of these performance requirements, then, oh, one too far, this is what we're going to look like for a Class 2. So, yeah, we've got a very old, looks like a 1930s building here, but here's how all 4 performance requirements are going to be applicable. So inside each and every SOU or apartment, we've got a J1, P2 and a J1, P3 being applicable just for that SOU. We broaden it out. We've got J1, P1 or energy use being applied to the common areas of this building. And then we've got the J1, P4 renewable energy and EV charging being applied to that building as a whole. So for a fairly, dare I say, stock standard Class 2 building, this is how the 4 performance requirements will apply to it. Conversely, if we have a look at a Class 5 building, We no longer see the J1, P2 and J1, P3 because they're isolated to the Class 2 SOUs and Class 4 part of a building. So in a Class 5 building, we're going to have our J1, P1 energy use, so that broader one that covers common areas and Class 5 to 9 and so on. And we're going to also have our J1, P4 for renewable energy and EV charging, so our solar PVs and EV charging readiness and so on. So that hopefully gives a good sort of indication on different buildings and how the provisions are going to apply. Now, we go back to the context of it. How do we actually achieve compliance with these performance requirements? And I'm sure everyone's seen this diagram used a million times. So we've got our performance requirements being J1, P1 through to J1, P4. Now, how do we actually satisfy that? So we can do a performance solution. Two mechanisms. It might be directly assessed against the performance requirements or a first principles approach, or we could do an equivalent to DTS. Or we could also go into a deemed to satisfy solution. And the deemed to satisfy solution means it's deemed to have met the performance requirements, and there's a really strong mechanism there to show compliance. But we'll have a look at these two pathways closer as we go. But before we do that, what's a presentation without a quiz? So we've got a quick quiz here. Performance requirements J1, P2 and J1, P3 do not apply to a Class 3 SOU within a hotel. So you'll see a pop-up there you can answer this question with. And the answer is true. J1, P2 and J1, P3 only apply to a Class 2 SOU or a Class 4 part of a building. So Class 3 SOU is outside of the application of those. So now we'll have a look at deemed to satisfy pathways and what does DTS compliance look like for the new provisions. The most critical clause for DTS and how you're going to shape compliance is your J2D2. So J2D1 is your standard DTS provisions, which talks about your performance requirements and the DTS clause. But then J2D2 is the application of Section J. And this is really important because it provides a direct link between the performance requirement, which we're trying to satisfy, and the specific DTS clauses that need to be addressed to get a compliant solution. So I would say if you're looking for compliance via a DTS pathway, J2D2 is your first port of call because it's going to tell you exactly what you need to do to satisfy those performance requirements. And I've got the cut and paste directly out of the NCC there, and that's what it looks like. And you just follow that through, find out what you actually need to do. If we start breaking that out into particular buildings and particular pathways, I've got a flow chart here, hierarchical chart. So we're looking for NCC compliance, so that broader compliance with the performance requirements. And then we've got our 4 performance requirements. So in a Class 2 building, every one of those 4, I should say, is going to be applicable. So we've got J1, P1, we've got an elemental type provisions we can do that. thermal performance under J1P2, we can go NADAS or elemental. J1P3, NADAS or manual calculation, and J1P4 is more of an elemental provision. So we're looking to satisfy the performance requirements, and here's a snapshot overview of what the DTS requirements actually are under there. And again, going back to J2D2 gives you the core detail of what needs to be done there. Now we looked at a class 2 and we looked at a class 5 building. So if we jump across back to that class 5 building, because it's a class 5, we don't have to worry about performance requirement J1, P2 and P3. So we're just looking how do we satisfy J1, P1 and J1, P4. And here's our flow chart of what that looks like. So we can do elemental provisions for J1, P1, and we can do elemental provisions for J1, P4. That's under a DTS banner alone. Yes, there's performance solutions and so on to go with that. But a class 5, purely DTS, that's what it's going to look like. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll run through the class 2 building example, and we'll have a look at these DTS pathways in a bit more detail so we can see what's included in there. So we've got our class 2 building that we introduced earlier, and we'll start off by looking at the individual SOUs, and we'll look at J1, P2 and P3 performance requirements and how we're going to satisfy those performance requirements via DTS approach. So we're looking at the individual SOU, and now we're going to look at J1, P2 first. So our pathways for compliance here are a NADAS star rating, or we've got new provisions which enable an elemental provision approach. So similar to volume 2, how you could do a NADAS rating or an elemental provision, the elemental has been introduced by popular demand, I guess, into volume 1. So you can now do a class 2 SOU via elemental as well. It's not just isolated to NADAS star rating. So if we look at the NADAS pathway, compliance through J2, D2 talks about you need to comply with J3, D3, and you've got to use house energy rating software. House energy rating software is a defined term, and that links to your NADAS accredited software. So when we start exploring the specifics of this under J3, D3, what we have and the changes include we've got an increase in the average star rating. So we're going from 6 stars to 7 stars as an average across all the SOUs, and individually an SOU can't be less than 6 stars. So an average of 7, not less than 6. And then to go with that, our heating and cooling loads have been revised. So the ABCB standard for heating and cooling loads is revised effectively to represent the changes in stringency that we've gone through here. Now, there are additional DTS provisions under J3, D3. It's not just a case of here's the NADAS report and we're all okay. We still need to consider the various other things, just like we do in volume 2, but we need to think about this, the thermal breaks, compensation if you've got ceiling insulation gaps, say exhaust fans and so on, our general thermal construction. We all love the phrase, the installation of insulation. That's an important one there to make sure that's installed correctly. Floor edge, if needed, and building ceiling comes into it as well. So it's not just a case of NADAS alone. There are also additional DTS clauses that we need to address along the way. Now, if we look at the elemental pathway, so if you choose not to use NADAS, you can go directly via the elemental provisions, and we'll look at the basic building fabric items along the way there. So we'll look at building fabric, our glazing, building ceiling and thermal breaks and so on. There's more detail in the code if you're interested there. But predominantly the assessment, or the indications are the assessment will still stay predominantly with NADAS pathway. This just introduces an alternative where NADAS can't be used or someone doesn't want to use NADAS. So additional option here effectively. Now, if we look at J1P3 for energy usage, we've got two different ways to comply via a DTS for each SOU. Again, we're isolated within just a single SOU here. So we've got a NATAS rating, or we've got a net equivalent energy usage or a manual calculation to go with that. And what we need to comply with are specified here. That's just a excerpt from J2D2, effectively telling you what you need to do to satisfy that complete performance requirement. But if we look at the NATAS DTS pathway for whole of home, that says we need to comply with J3D15. We'll get to that one in a moment. We need to use house energy rating software, which is the NATAS accredited software, accredited under the NATAS scheme, and we need a whole of home rating of not less than 50. And that's really the two key ones: NATAS software, whole of home rating not less than 50. And on the right-hand side here, we see an example of what the rating is going to look like on a NATAS report. And be my guest to scan the QR code there, and it'll take you to an example report of what you will likely see in the industry. Now, there's a key difference between Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1 needs a whole of home rating of 50 out of 100, whereas Volume 2 needs a rating of 60 out of 100. And that just reflects the difference in the construction techniques and a few other things along the way there. But it's important to remember that a Class 2 SOU is different to a single residential Class 1 dwelling. Now, the NATAS pathway considers the same things as it does in Volume 2. So we're going to be looking at heating and cooling load appliances. We're going to be looking at hot water, lighting, swimming pool and spa equipment, and on-site energy generation, such as solar PVs. The beauty with the NATAS pathway is it considers the thermal fabric and the performance of that thermal fabric in doing the assessment. So it gives a more detailed analysis, if you will. Now, one common question that we've been receiving a bit, what about centralised services, and can I still use NATAS to do that? Really good question. At the moment, that is still, I believe, in development by NATAS, and they're giving guidance about when it's going to be released and providing more and more information as time progresses closer to the mandatory introduction of the NCC 2022. I think at the end of the day, the important thing is, does it comply with the NATAS scheme? So that's the compliance threshold. So if NATAS provides information and they can confirm that however they give the guidance on however that's going to work, if that threshold question can be answered, does this comply with the NATAS scheme, then it's okay. Yes, it's likely to be an inbuilt mechanism of the software, but I'd keep in mind just that threshold question of if it complies or not with the scheme. And that's what the NCC is going to look like. We need it to comply with the NATAS scheme, and anything that you do through that software has to comply with the scheme. That's the important thing. Another area which is of high importance, that if for some reason you can't use NATAS as a DTS pathway for J1P3 for energy usage, say, for example, centralised services may fit into that, may not. But if you can't use NATAS for J1P3, that does not affect the use of NATAS for J1P2. So you can do your 6-star minimum 7-star average for your thermal performance, and then you can use the manual calculation for J1P3 if necessary. So just a reminder that those two performance requirements are separate, and you can use NATAS for one and not the other if you choose to. So then we look at the manual calculation. So our net equivalent energy usage, and the details of that are under J3D14. We've got the manual calculation talking about calculation A must not exceed calculation B. We're limited to a floor area not greater than 500 square metres. Calculation A and B consider very similar things to the NATA software. So we're looking at heating and cooling appliances, hot water, lighting, and so on. To make things easier, ABCB has a calculator that's available for use for that. Now, the data or the inputs for that come through the ABCB standard for whole of home efficiency factors. There's a degree of flexibility built into that. So if you're intending to use it, the recommendation is to understand the document thoroughly, particularly reading the leading in section about how you can and can't use that document. But like I said, there is a degree of flexibility built into that calculation. So that's the individual SOUs that we've just covered. So now we'll have a look at J1P1 energy usage, and we're going to be having a look at this for the common areas. So again, what does compliance look like? So we're looking at class 2 common areas here, excluding the SOUs. And we've got our J1P1 as our relevant performance requirement. And to satisfy that, we need to comply with J4 to J8 plus J3D3. And what is the detail of that? So we've got our broader conditions that haven't changed drastically from 2019 to 2022. So we're looking at building fabric, building ceiling, aircon, ventilation, artificial light, pools, and J9D3 for facilities for energy monitoring when you hit those relevant thresholds there. But these ones are very much an elemental type approach where you work your way through those relevant clauses associated with that. And the last performance requirement that we are going to address from a DTS perspective is J1P4, which covers renewable energy and EV charging. So what does compliance look like? So this is applicable to a class 2 to 9 building as a whole. And we're going to be looking at how do we satisfy J1P4? Well, the clauses are J9D4 and J9D5. So we've got 2 particular clauses that we need to address to get our J1P4 compliance. So we'll start off with J9D4, facilities for EV charging equipment. Probably a topic that a lot of people have got interest with, considering the discussion in the industry. So the purpose of J9D4 is to provide the ease of retrofit for EV charging equipment. And that's important that we are focusing on ease of retrofit, not actual installation. We're just making it easy for future installation. A lot of the work under J9D4 is isolated to the electrical distribution board. So what we're looking at is the distribution boards are set up for EV charging, so they're labelled. They've got a control system to manage building demand. We've got a particular width of DIN rail. So the DIN rail is a proprietary system that's introduced, and effectively the section in the back end of the image on the right there. We just need to have the space in the distribution board for it. Now, J9D4 doesn't apply to a standalone Class 9A. Apologies, it doesn't apply to a standalone Class 7A. But again, we're really dealing with having the distribution boards ready to support EV charging equipment. When you go into J9D4, there's a lot of information about the minimum delivery based on a total building demand. So a Class 2 has different provisions to a Class 3 and to a Class 5 to 9 and so on. So there are further info in there. Then the big question, EV charging and future work. So there is a lot of work occurring nationally to understand if there are any unintended risks associated with EVs. There's a lot of conversation around the possible fire safety risk and so on. But the work there in that space is still progressing, and I encourage you to have a look at the ABCB information that they've released on the matter. Follow the QR code down the bottom, and there's some really good information contained within that, and sort of setting up what compliance is going to look like, safety, fire risk, and so on within that. Now, importantly, any associated fire risk with EVs is a separate item to energy efficiency. So that will not influence the compliance pathways for energy efficiency. So we've got our J9D4 that we need to satisfy. If there is or isn't a fire risk associated with it, that's likely to fall under your Part C or your Part E. But that's a side topic to just pure compliance with Part J of the NCC. But again, really strongly encourage you to have a read of ABCB's material and follow that QR code that's down the bottom of the screen right now. Moving on to J9D5, facilities for solar PVs and battery systems. Again, we're pretty much in the electrical switchboard here. We're looking for empty slots and DIN rail spaces, labelled and sized and so on, to make sure that the future retrofit of solar PVs is going to be relatively, or much easier, I should say. Outside the distribution board, we've got a requirement that at least 20% of the roof area is left clear for the installation of PV panels. Now, there are some exemptions there. So if you've already got PVs installed, you've got another form of generation, electricity generation on site, roof area is shaded, a small roof area, or the roof area is used for other things. So just be mindful of these exemptions as you're applying it. And the last one with the solar PVs is there has been some changes to reflect solar PVs within the structural provisions of Part B. So we've got performance requirement B1P1 talks about an additional 0.15 kPa roof load for 7B, and our DTS also reflects that with a 0.15 roof load for 7B. Now, it's important to note that these are, again, for the ease of retrofit in Class 7B buildings. It doesn't alter the structural assessment when you're coming to install the solar panels. You still need to ensure that the building is going to comply with Part B. In the case of a Class 7B building, in some cases, there's been situations where the installation of the solar PVs have been challenging on existing buildings, and this should address this in the future. Now, it doesn't alter the Act and the regulations mechanisms to get to compliance. It's just a mechanism to make it easier for a Class 7B in the future. That's something that needs to be considered for compliance with Part B. So another quick quiz here. EV charging stations are required to be installed in buildings for a compliant DTS solution. So have an answer of that on the pop-up. And the answer to that is false. The provisions just allow for equipment. They don't mandate the installation of them. And that is our DTS pathway completed for the performance requirements. So now we'll have a look at the performance solution pathway. So performance solutions. So the process for a performance solution is specified under A2G2, which was formerly the A2.2. And that gives us two options to demonstrate how a performance solution is going to comply. It can be directly assessed against the performance requirement or first principles approach, or it can be shown to be at least equivalent to DTS. So this mechanism hasn't changed, but the quantified performance requirements does introduce a different layer to that, especially when you're going to do a first principles performance solution approach. Broadly speaking, if you're looking at a performance solution, then the outcomes should be relatively similar between the quantified performance requirements, your NATA's DTS approach, or your DTS elemental approach. So regardless of the method used, the values essentially should be very much similar. They're not going to be identical just based on the pure nature of building as a whole, but they should be relatively consistent. And in terms of consistency, consistency comes back to quantified performance requirements as your primary consistency point. So NATAs should be consistent with the quantified performance requirement, DTS element. This diagram gives you a good rule of thumb or thought about if you see a performance requirement that looks like it is vastly under, say, a NATA's approach or something like that. It gives you scope to ask a few more questions, dig a little bit deeper and find out what's going on. Yes, it may comply, but it gives you an opportunity to explore that further and see what compliance actually is. First principles approach, J1P1 has a bit of quantification to it already with our hourly regulated energy consumption. And then we go J1P2 and P3. So we're really specific on that. So we go into specification 44, tells us exactly what the heating and cooling loads are going to be. J1P3 goes into a GEMS determination, power density. Again, we're going to get really specified values of what they're going to look like. And then our J1P4 is more qualitative around the renewable energy and EV charging. So there's not defined values in there. But the quantified performance requirements will increase the stringency in your, or increase the requirements in your performance solution because they're going to have to actually address quantified numbers rather than just qualitative statements effectively. If you do a first principles approach, you don't need to consider any of the DTS requirements because you're not doing an equivalence to DTS, you're doing first principles as well. Equivalence to DTS, so this has got many ways to achieve it, but probably the one that we're most familiar with is the verification methods. And we've got a new verification method with NCC 2022 for J1V5 verification using a reference building or the verb. So your verb will apply to a class 2 SOU in a similar manner, and similar is the key, similar manner to the way it has done for a class 1 dwelling. So we're going to be taking for a class 2 SOU, you take your DTS elemental provisions, you use that to model to get your heating and cooling loads, and then you apply that to your class 2 design using different software as well. If we break out the hierarchy, how they actually look and what they're actually going to do. So we've got multiple verification methods for J1P1 and 2 for J1P2 and P3. So J1P1, we're still going to neighbours energy green star verification using a reference building under J1V3, and the building ceiling verification method only covers part. But J1P1 is largely unchanged in that space. So J1P1, remember your common areas or your class 3, your class 5 to 9 parts of the building. We move across into J1P2 and P3. We've got the new J1V5, the verb verification method, which will cover off on both of those. And J1V4 for building ceiling covers off part of J1P2, and it's just the building ceiling part. So these are the verification methods that are available. Verification methods are just one way of showing how a performance solution complies. It's not the only way, but they do offer a really robust process to get to compliance. Performance solution using the verb. So we get this question a bit. There's limited DTS elemental provisions for the reference building. Can I still use J1V5 in most situations? And the answer is yes, because what we're doing through the verb is we're trying to establish hypothetical heating and cooling loads to then compare the proposed building against. So you just need to be mindful that specification 33 and 45 have particular aspects that need to be the same as a reference building, but the whole entire building, the whole entire reference building does not need to be identical to the proposed one. So there is still a lot of scope because fundamentally we're just establishing heating and cooling loads for those. Also worth remembering with all performance solutions, and the verification method is a performance solution as well, it needs to be documented thoroughly to show how compliance with the NCC is achieved. So our A2G2 process for performance solutions. We can't merge together various performance requirements. We have to address them individually. They have to be independently satisfied. Yes, there's a degree of interaction, reliance, and so on, but ultimately, at the end of the day, each of those performance requirements must be satisfied independently. So another quick quiz here. Are verification methods the only performance solution option to comply with the performance requirement? The answer to that is no. Verification methods are an assessment option under the governing requirements and is just one option of showing how a performance solution complies. And it's certainly not the only option that's available. But the beauty of a verification method is that it gives a very robust process for you to follow to show how compliance is going to be achieved. And that covers off the performance solution part. So we've satisfied our performance requirement. So if you think back to A2G1, NCC compliance is performance requirements and governing requirements. So our performance requirements are done. Now we'll have a quick look at the governing requirements. One of the key changes here is A5G9, which is under the evidence of suitability pathway or requirements. And A5G9 has been introduced. So the evidence of suitability for NADAs must be a certificate issued in accordance with the NADAs scheme. Now, this assessment method under the code applies for wherever you use NADAs pathway, either via a performance or a DTS solution, because the assessment methods or evidence of suitability is an assessment method for both performance and DTS. It is just applicable to the NADAs pathway only. So what does that mean? So if you're using a verification method that's using different software that's not NADAs, then you don't need a certificate under the evidence of suitability issued in accordance with the NADAs scheme because it's not NADAs software. So just when NADAs is used, evidence of suitability process requires that certificate issued in accordance with the scheme. Another question that we get asked regularly, is a NADAs accredited assessor required under the evidence of suitability changes? And the answer to that is no, because compliance with the NADAs rules for certificates is a different process and a different requirement to that of assessor accreditation. So the wording of the evidence of suitability clause means it has to be issued in accordance with the NATA's scheme, and an assessor accreditation is a separate process to that. So if you need more information to that, Practice Note EE03 can give you more details. Click on the QR code on the bottom. But important to remember that A5G9 doesn't mandate the use of NATA's accredited assessor. In saying all of this, the use of NATA's accredited assessors is probably 99-point-something% of all assessments done. So really encourage people to use that. If you do happen to find yourself in a position where a non-accredited assessor has issued the certificate, then you're probably going to need to ask more questions, explore that further and dig into it in greater detail. So it's not a blanket does or doesn't comply. It's non-accredited assessor needs more exploration. Hence why the EE03 practice note is a valuable resource because it can give you some guidance as to what you should and shouldn't be looking at with that. And lastly, we're going to cover off on the transitions from 2019 to 2022. So we're all familiar, recently the announcement was made that we're extending from the 1st of October through to 1st of May 2024. So at the moment, as we speak now, we've got an optional uptake where you can use either 2019 or 2022 NCC for energy efficiency. That optional uptake expires on the 1st of May 2024 and NCC 2022 becomes mandatory. And beyond the 1st of May 2024, there's still some scope to use Section 10 of the Building Act to use the 2019 edition of the code. And we'll have a look at that one. Section 10 of the Building Act talks about substantial progress made on the design of the building prior to the new regulation coming in. The code is part of the regulations, so it is effectively a regulation. So beyond 1st of May, NCC 2019 may be used. If you're looking for some guidance on that, Minister's Guideline MG13 provides a great deal of detailed information on it. A reminder that under the wording of Section 10 of the Building Act here, a building surveyor has discretion in applying Section 10, and it's not going to be a given in every scenario. So there has to be a process that people go through, so the applicant needs to justify it, and they really do need to justify it well. It's not just up to the building surveyor to justify it. Applicant goes through the process, presents that to the building surveyor, and they can make a decision based on the information they have available to them as to whether they're going to accept that or not. So really important is discretion. Worst case scenario, the Building Appeals Board can hear and determine on that if needed. But the advice and the guidance would be consider moving to NCC 2022 as early as practicable. That will avoid any issues when it comes to can we use Section 10 or not. The quicker you move to it, the quicker you start getting familiar with it, the better and easier things should be. So when we look at the transition, we've got the notes out of the NCC here. So I've cut and pasted there the note at the start of Part J, talking about when Section J is going to be applicable, how you can use 2019 and so on. Now, this note is a mandatory part of the NCC, so it has to be complied with. It applies to the part of the NCC where the note is contained only. So this note is only relevant to Part J. When you use Part J under this note, then the whole part must be used. So you can't just pick, say, a 6-star requirement from 2019, then the whole of home from 2022, and vice versa. If you're going to use Part J 2022, you need to use the whole thing. Now, with the modification and the extended transition times, that's the mechanism for that is likely to be a regulation change. So just keep an eye on that in the future, because that's going to alter the note in the NCC, which it can under the process of the Act and the regulations. So if we look at the section to which the note applies, I've got an example here where you can use Part J from 2019 for energy efficiency, because we've got the note that you can see there. And in addition to that, you can use Part F8 from NCC 2022 for condensation management, because that has its own note as well. So those different parts can be sort of swapped around as need be, but you can't just modify within a part. That's important about reading the notes correctly. Alterations and additions. So with NCC compliance, we see an increase in the stringency, but overall, the mechanism for NCC compliance is largely unchanged. We're still looking at A2G1 satisfying our performance requirements and our governing requirements. Then we move out into the alterations and addition space under the existing buildings in the building regulations 2018. Regulation 233, the consent to partial compliance is unchanged by NCC 2022. So at the end of the day, we've got an increase in stringency, but if you're doing an alteration addition, then the building surveyor can consent to partial compliance through that process, which is important process there. EEO4 can give you some more indication of what that's going to look like, some more background, what those decision-making parameters are. And really, we're looking for something that's going to be a reasonable, balanced outcome. We don't want a complete demolition of a building, for example. That's not what the clause means. We can make reasonable steps towards a better performing building. Another question that we get asked regularly, and this is a very broad question, can the VBA issue a practice note with additional regulations to assist with? Insert the topic here. We get asked that a lot. We're looking at the VBA practice notes. Can you give us additional regulations for us to comply with? Practice notes that the VBA issue are really for guidance purposes, and they're just giving additional information on compliance. These don't create additional regulations. So as much as we like to give more information on compliance, we can't set any rules, so to speak, about what compliance is or isn't going to look like. All we can do is guide industry for that. So a good reminder about what VBA practice notes are there for and what they're trying to achieve is for guidance, not for regulation. And we've got a quick quiz. We've got 4 questions here, so you may need to scroll down in the pop-up screen. I'll give you a moment to answer those. Okay, so first question, NATA's whole home rating, is it the same? No, it's not. 50 out of 100 for Class 2, 60 for Class 1. Verification methods are just one way of satisfying a performance requirement, so there are other pathways in there. Number 3, Class 2 building, a NATA star rating is just one way of a number of ways, including elemental pathway to demonstrate compliance. And solar PVs don't need to be installed on every Class 2 to 9 building at the moment. We're just ensuring that we've got an ease of retrofit for future installations. But that's covered our session today, and we've gone through just the broader overview of NCC compliance and the compliance framework from a regulator perspective of what we actually want from it. So hopefully we've got a clearer picture of the changes to energy efficiency, but really importantly, I hope you've got a clear picture of what compliance with the NCC for energy efficiency actually looks like. How do we comply with our performance requirements? How do we achieve a full DTS solution or a performance solution? How do we satisfy the governing requirements? And those principles will extend way beyond energy efficiency, but that's really key. So thank you for staying with us.
Thanks for the presentation, Sean. I know there was a lot of information being delivered on this hybrid webinar. We will now move on to the pre-submitted questions we've received during the registration process. So thank you to everyone who took the time to submit their questions. It's greatly appreciated. Again, just a quick reminder, where your questions are unanswered during the webinar, we will collate all your unanswered questions and we'll provide an answer to as many of these as possible. A copy of the Q&A will be sent out with your proof of attendance certificates in the following weeks. All right, Sean. Let's go to the question. Question 1. What do building surveyors need to focus on when assessing for DTS compliance?
Okay, so I think the important thing here is assessing and reviewing the J2D2, the application of part. So you're really clear about what performance requirements you're trying to satisfy and then what particular clauses that you need to meet to satisfy those. Now, a good reminder is to ensure, yes, you satisfy each one of those DTS clauses, but then also don't forget you've got assessment methods that you need to be mindful of, so evidence of suitability, expert judgment, the like. And the last one is be mindful about consistency through the entire package of documentation. So in audits that VBA has done, it's been identified at times that there can be discrepancies between information in, say, working drawings and the NATA's drawings and so on. That's not to say it's on purpose. There's additions, changes and so on, but just be mindful that the entire application package is consistent. That's the key there.
Okay, awesome. Question 2 we've got, is condensation a result of increase of energy efficiency?
So the easy answer for that is it's complicated. There's many opinions going for and against that statement to say yes it is and no it's not. And there's a lot of work being done at a national level and it will be addressed in future codes. I think the point that we need to make is condensation is within a different part of the NCC, within your health and amenity to the energy efficiency. So from compliance perspective, it's making sure you comply with the condensation requirements and then comply with the energy efficiency requirements also. The addressing condensation will occur in due course.
Okay. Question 3, how will the change affect alterations and additions?
So I spoke about this in the slide earlier. There's an increase in stringency, but the mechanisms through the NCC or through the regulations remain unchanged. If you're looking at a Class 2 building, you probably unlikely to trigger the threshold for addition that requires the compliance with a new part. So more often than not, you're going to have the consent to partial compliance option available. And at the end of the day, where the wording of the Regulation 233 and the intent of that is to get reasonable and balanced improvements and get whatever we can without sort of being too burdensome for industry. So bear that in mind in the way that you apply it, and the VBA has practice notes to support that as well.
Yeah, that's right. Last one, is there more information on the insulation requirements for walls and roof systems?
So whether you use the NATAS or the elemental approach, the clause J4D3 describes what's required for insulation and so on. So that's relatively clear about what that looks like. There are other factors throughout with insulation and how that interacts with wall and roof systems as a whole. So just be mindful that compliance with the insulation under Part J for energy efficiency is just compliance with Part J. You still need to be mindful that there could be certain provisions under, say, Part C if the wall, for example, has an FRL system or requires a degree of non-combustibility in there. We could have requirements under Part F where you've got weatherproofing systems or sound transmission systems as well. So yes, insulation forms part of Part J, but there are other parts of the code that you need to be mindful of along that way, and compliance is required with each of those parts as well. So think about the broader building as a whole when you're doing the analysis of it too.
Okay, I think we are at time. Thank you so much for that, Sean. Thanks for your presentation and your comments on the questions that have been submitted.
We're now at the end of our hybrid webinar, guys. Thank you all for taking the time to attend, and I hope you've enjoyed this session. Just a quick reminder, we will collate all the unanswered questions and we'll provide an answer to them, as many of them as possible, and we'll send the answers in the coming weeks. We will also be sending out an email that includes our webinar survey and a proof of attendance and the link to today's webinar and slideshow. We value your feedback, so please take the time to participate in the surveys that are coming out. To also find out our next practitioner education series, please do also head to our websites and keep an eye out on the emails that will be coming through. And thanks again. I hope you all had a great day. Thanks.